The story of Todd Stomper. Givens does not begin with a single crime or a single moment of notoriety. It begins with a pattern, one defined by aggression, domination, and an identity forged through violence, long before the prison gates closed behind him. By the time Givens became a recognized name inside California's prison system, his reputation had already been cemented as someone who did not merely survive violence, but actively sought it out. Within the rigid hierarchy of California prisons, few names inspire the kind of caution associated with Givens. Known by the moniker Stomper, he emerged as a validated member of the Nazi lowriders, a white supremacist prison gang with deep ties to the Aryan Brotherhood, one of the most feared and entrenched prison gangs in the United States. Membership in such an organization is not symbolic. It is earned through blood, loyalty, and a demonstrated willingness to commit extreme acts of violence on command. The Nazi lowriders, often referred to simply as NLR, operate as both an ideological and criminal enterprise. While their white supremacist beliefs form the surface identity, their true power lies in organized violence, drug trafficking, extortion, and contract killings inside prison walls. For inmates like Givens, affiliation offered protection, power, and purpose, but it also demanded absolute obedience. Once validated, there is no neutrality, no quiet exit. The gang becomes the inmate's identity. Givens' physical appearance reflected this commitment. According to prison documentation, he bore an unmistakable tattoo of Adolf Hitler on the back of his shaved head, a permanent declaration of allegiance that removed any doubt about where his loyalties lay. In the prison environment, tattoos are not merely personal expression. They are credentials. They signal rank, ideology, and readiness for violence. For guards and rival inmates alike, such markings marked Givens as someone capable of extreme acts. Before his name was associated with death row or gang leadership, Givens had already cultivated a reputation for volatility. Prosecutors and investigators would later describe him as impulsive, aggressive, and deeply immersed in criminal thinking. Violence was not incidental. It was instrumental. It was how disputes were settled, respect was demanded, and fear was maintained. This mindset followed him into incarceration. Unlike inmates who attempt to keep their heads down, Givens quickly aligned himself with power structures inside prison. In the highly racialized environment of California yards, race-based gangs dominate daily life. Alliances determine survival, and neutrality is often interpreted as weakness. Givens did not choose neutrality. He chose affiliation with one of the most violent white supremacist gangs operating behind bars. His rise within the Nazi lowriders coincided with an era of heightened tension between white power gangs and prison authorities. California correctional institutions were already struggling to control organized gang activity, and inmates like Givens represented a worst-case scenario. Ideologically driven, violent, and undeterred by long sentences. For such individuals, prison is not a deterrent. It is a battlefield. By the early 2000s, Givens was no longer just another inmate. He was someone known to staff, intelligence officers, and rival gang members. His nickname circulated in whispers, often attached to warnings. This notoriety would soon extend beyond prison walls when his involvement in a brutal double murder drew statewide attention. Yet even before that case came to define him legally, those who encountered Givens understood something crucial. Incarceration had not softened him. If anything, confinement intensified his behavior. The rigid environment of prison, where dominance is currency and weakness is punished, served to amplify the traits that had already defined his life. This is the foundation upon which the rest of the story is built. Todd Stomper. Givens was not a man pulled into violence by circumstance alone. He gravitated toward it, embraced it, and embedded himself in systems that rewarded brutality. His gang affiliation, his appearance, and his conduct all pointed in the same direction. A trajectory that would culminate in murder, death row, and continued bloodshed behind bars. By the early 2000s, Todd Stomper Givens had already demonstrated a capacity for violence that set him apart, but it was a crime committed outside prison walls that would ultimately define him in the eyes of the law. The case that followed would not only place him on death row, but would expose the depth of brutality that prosecutors argued was central to his character. In April of 2001, the disappearance of siblings Barry Holstone and Patreace Holstone set off a chain of events that would end in one of Tulare County's most disturbing homicide investigations. The victims were eventually discovered in a manner that left a lasting impression even on seasoned investigators. Their bodies were found inside the trunk of a burned vehicle, abandoned in an olive orchard. The car had been deliberately set on fire, an apparent attempt to destroy evidence and obscure the circumstances of their deaths. From the outset, the crime scene suggested planning rather than impulse. The remote location, the use of fire, and the concealment of the bodies pointed to an effort to ensure the victims would not be easily found. Prosecutors would later argue that the murders were not random, but the result of a dispute involving stolen property, a conflict that escalated into calculated execution. Investigators focused their attention on Todd Givens, whose name surfaced repeatedly as the inquiry deepened. According to the prosecution's case, Givens played a central role in the killings. What made the case particularly striking, however, was the involvement of his own family. His wife, Lacey Givens, and his mother, Cheryl Givens, were both charged in connection with the murders. Authorities alleged that the women assisted either before or after the killings, acting as accessories or aiding and abetting the crime. The inclusion of close family members transformed the case from a straightforward homicide prosecution into a broader examination of loyalty, influence, and criminal complicity. For prosecutors, it reinforced the image of Givens as someone capable of drawing others into acts of extreme violence, even those closest to him. For the defense, it became a point of contention as attorneys attempted to challenge the extent of each individual's involvement. As the case moved through the courts, the details painted a grim picture. The jury heard how the victims were killed, transported, and concealed. The prosecution emphasized the deliberate nature of the crime, arguing that it reflected not only intent, but a complete disregard for human life. The manner in which the bodies were disposed of, locked in a trunk and burned, was presented as evidence of cruelty and calculation. In July of 2004, after years of legal proceedings, Todd Stomper Givens stood before the court in Tulare County for sentencing. The verdict was clear: guilty of double murder. The sentence was severe. Givens was condemned to death, joining California's death row population and cementing his status as one of the state's most dangerous inmates. The convictions of Lacey and Cheryl Givens followed, further underscoring the scope of the crime. While their sentences differed, the message from the court was unmistakable. This was not an isolated act by a single man, but a crime enabled by a network of loyalty and fear. For Givens, the sentence marked a turning point, but not an end. Death row, particularly at San Quentin State Prison, is often perceived as the final chapter for condemned inmates. For some, it brings isolation and reflection. For others, it becomes another arena for dominance and violence. In Givens' case, prosecutors and prison officials would later argue that the death sentence did nothing to curb his behavior. The gravity of the Holstone murders followed Givens into prison. Among inmates, a death sentence can confer a twisted form of status, someone with nothing left to lose. In the context of prison gangs, this perception can elevate an individual's value as an enforcer or participant in high-risk violence. Authorities would later note that Givens' conduct behind bars suggested he embraced this identity rather than resisted it. As he was transferred into the death row housing unit at San Quentin, Givens entered one of the most tightly controlled environments in the California Department of Corrections. Yet even there, the same patterns that had defined his life on the outside began to reemerge. The murders that had put him on death row were not the conclusion of his violent trajectory. They were the prelude. For many inmates, a death sentence represents the end of movement, the end of influence, and the beginning of long isolation. For Todd Stomper, Givens' death row became something else entirely. It was not a place of restraint, but a new arena, one where his reputation, gang allegiance, and capacity for violence continued to grow. After his 2004 sentencing, Givens was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, California's most infamous correctional institution, and home to the state's death row. San Quentin's death row is designed to limit interaction, restrict mobility, and reduce opportunities for violence. In theory, inmates condemned to die are separated from the general prison population and placed under constant surveillance. In practice, however, death row remains a volatile environment populated by individuals with long histories of violence and little incentive to follow rules. From the outset, Givens stood out. Correctional officers and prison intelligence units quickly flagged him as a high-risk inmate. His affiliation with the Nazi lowriders, combined with his death sentence, made him a particularly dangerous presence. Among white supremacist inmates, a condemned prisoner can become a valuable asset, someone willing to commit acts that others might hesitate to carry out due to fear of additional punishment. Givens' behavior behind bars reinforced this assessment. Rather than withdrawing into isolation, he remained actively involved in prison politics. Authorities believed he maintained connections with other white power inmates, including members of the Aryan Brotherhood, despite the physical separation imposed by death row housing. Communication in prison rarely relies on direct contact alone. Notes, coded language, and intermediaries allow influence to travel even through locked doors. In 2006, Givens' name surfaced in connection with a violent incident that sent shockwaves through death row. He was accused of involvement in the stabbing of Curtis Price, an Aryan Brotherhood hitman and fellow condemned inmate. The attack underscored the reality that even among white power factions, internal disputes could erupt into bloodshed. Prison officials viewed the incident as evidence that death row inmates were still capable of organizing and executing violent acts despite extreme security measures. The stabbing raised uncomfortable questions for the California Department of Corrections. How could an inmate already sentenced to death still pose such a serious threat? For investigators, the answer lay in a combination of ideology, gang loyalty, and personal disposition. Givens was not merely serving time, he was continuing a lifestyle. Over the years that followed, his disciplinary record continued to grow. Each incident added to a portrait of an inmate unwilling or unable to comply with authority. Guards described him as hostile, confrontational, and unpredictable. Fellow inmates regarded him with a mixture of fear and caution. His shaved head and notorious tattoo, Adolf Hitler emblazoned on the back, served as a constant reminder of his allegiance and mindset. The most alarming incident came years later, on July 16th, 2020. According to prison reports, Givens allegedly attempted to slash a correctional officer's throat through the food port of his cell door. The weapon was improvised, constructed from razor blades and nail clippers, items commonly restricted due to their potential for misuse. The attack, though unsuccessful, stunned prison staff. For correctional officers, food ports represent one of the few moments of vulnerability during routine operations. An attack through such a small opening demonstrated both ingenuity and intent. Investigators concluded that the act was premeditated, not spontaneous. The implications were serious. Even under death row conditions, Givens had found a way to turn limited resources into a potentially lethal weapon. The attempted assault triggered immediate consequences. Givens was subjected to additional restrictions, including tighter supervision and reduced privileges. But for many within the prison system, the damage had already been done. The incident reinforced a growing consensus that Givens represented an ongoing existential threat, not just to other inmates, but to staff tasked with maintaining order. Psychologically, the attack also revealed something deeper. By 2020, Givens had been incarcerated for nearly 2 decades and on death row for more than 15 years. The prospect of execution had not softened him. If anything, it appeared to embolden him. Prison psychologists and intelligence officers would later note that inmates with nothing left to lose can become increasingly dangerous over time, especially when fueled by extremist ideology. Within white supremacist circles, acts of defiance against authority often enhance an inmate's reputation. Violence against staff is seen not as reckless, but as proof of commitment and fearlessness. Whether Givens intended the attack to serve as a message or simply as an act of aggression, the effect was the same. His standing as a feared figure was reinforced. By the early 2020s, Todd Stomper Givens had become emblematic of a broader failure to fully neutralize certain inmates. Despite maximum security, despite isolation, despite a death sentence, he remained capable of violence. His presence forced prison officials to confront an unsettling truth. Containment does not always equal control. As years passed, tensions within white power factions continued to simmer beneath the surface. Alliances shifted, loyalties fractured, and long-standing rivalries hardened. In this environment, even powerful figures could become targets. Givens, positioned at the intersection of gang politics and personal violence, would soon find himself linked to an event that reignited fears about unchecked power inside prison walls. Inside California's prison system, violence rarely occurs in a vacuum. Every assault, every killing, every act of defiance is shaped by an invisible web of alliances, rivalries, and power calculations. By the mid-2020s, Todd Stomper Givens existed squarely within that web, an inmate whose influence extended beyond his cell, rooted in ideology, reputation, and a demonstrated willingness to spill blood. White supremacist prison gangs operate under rigid, often unforgiving rules. Loyalty is absolute, hierarchy is enforced through violence, and perceived weakness can be fatal. The Nazi lowriders function as both an independent gang and a feeder organization closely aligned with the Aryan Brotherhood, which has historically dominated white power politics inside California prisons. While the two groups cooperate, they are not immune to tension. Power struggles, leadership disputes, and accusations of disloyalty are common, and when they arise, violence is the primary method of resolution. Givens' long-standing affiliation with the Nazi lowriders placed him in the middle of these dynamics. His death row status gave him a particular kind of leverage. In prison culture, Inmates serving death sentences are often viewed as expendable assets, individuals who can be relied upon to carry out high-risk actions because additional punishment carries little weight. For gang leadership, such inmates can be both useful and dangerous. Over time, intelligence units within the California Department of Corrections noted increasing instability within white power factions. Shifting alliances, internal discipline, and questions of authority created an atmosphere of suspicion. In such an environment, reputation became everything. Tattoos, past violence, and demonstrated ruthlessness were used to establish credibility. Givens, with his history of murder, attempted assaults, and ideological branding, embodied the image of uncompromising loyalty. But that same reputation also made him a potential threat to others within the movement. White supremacist gangs, despite their shared ideology, are notorious for turning inward. Informants are hunted, perceived rivals are eliminated, and even high-ranking members can be targeted if they are seen as liabilities or obstacles to control. Violence is not only a tool against enemies, it is a method of internal governance. By 2025, these tensions had reached a critical point. Todd Fox Morgan, a 57-year-old inmate and suspected high-ranking member of the Aryan Brotherhood, was a powerful figure in his own right. Within prison hierarchies, men like Morgan wield influence through years of connections, decisions, and enforcement. When such figures fall, it is rarely accidental. For investigators, the question was not whether violence could erupt between white power inmates, but when and who would be involved. Givens's name had long been associated with internal disputes, and his record suggested he was neither intimidated by rank nor constrained by consequences. In the closed ecosystem of prison life, unresolved rivalries tend to escalate until they explode. Prison yards, even under heavy supervision, remain flashpoints for these conflicts. They are among the few spaces where inmates can interact directly, read body language, and assert dominance in real time. Any breakdown in control, even momentary, can be exploited. For inmates deeply embedded in gang politics, such moments present opportunity. Behind the scenes, officials work to monitor communications and movements, but the reality of prison intelligence is imperfect. Conversations are coded, messages are passed indirectly, and motives are often concealed until after blood has been shed. By the time warning signs become visible, the outcome is frequently unavoidable. As the balance of power within white supremacist factions grew increasingly unstable, Givens remained a constant, an inmate with a proven record of violence, ideological commitment, and disregard for authority. Whether acting under orders, personal motive, or perceived necessity, he stood positioned to play a decisive role when tensions finally broke. That breaking point would come in October 2025 in a prison yard where long simmering conflicts turned fatal. In the final act, the story reaches its most recent and unresolved chapter, a killing that once again placed Todd Stomper Givens at the center of a deadly investigation and raised urgent questions about how much control the prison system truly holds over its most dangerous inmates. On October 23, 2025, the controlled routines of a California prison yard were shattered by sudden, lethal violence. In a system built on predictability and surveillance, the death of Todd Fox Morgan sent an immediate shock through correctional staff and inmate populations alike. Morgan, 57 years old, was not an ordinary prisoner. He was widely believed to be a high-ranking member of the Aryan Brotherhood, a man whose influence inside white supremacist circles had been built over decades. When such a figure is killed behind bars, It signals more than a personal dispute. It suggests a power shift. Investigators quickly moved to secure the yard and isolate potential suspects. Within hours, Todd Stomper Givens was identified as one of 3 inmates suspected in the fatal attack, alongside Ray Waldron and Robert England. All 3 were immediately transferred to restrictive housing, cutting off their access to the general population and limiting communication while the investigation began. For prison officials, Givens' name appearing on the suspect list was grimly unsurprising. His history of violence, his gang affiliation, and his prior assaults had long positioned him as a candidate for involvement in serious incidents. What made the killing particularly alarming, however, was the status of the victim. Morgan was not a low-level inmate. He was someone with standing, authority, and reach, qualities that do not vanish easily in prison. The circumstances of the attack were closely guarded as investigators worked to piece together what happened. What was clear was that the killing occurred in a shared space, where surveillance and staff presence are meant to deter exactly this kind of violence. The fact that it happened anyway exposed the persistent limitations of institutional control when faced with organized, motivated inmates. Within white power circles, the death of a suspected Aryan Brotherhood leader carried immediate implications. Such an act can be interpreted in multiple ways: an internal purge, a retaliation, or a calculated move to redraw the hierarchy. Each possibility carried consequences, not just for those directly involved, but for prison stability as a whole. For Givens, the incident marked the latest chapter in a long pattern. Decades after the murders that put him on death row, he was still being linked to lethal violence. The death sentence, the isolation, the heightened security, none of it had succeeded in neutralizing his impact. Instead, he remained a figure around whom violence seemed to orbit. As the investigation continued, unanswered questions loomed. Was the attack ordered? Was it spontaneous? Did it reflect a fracture between the Nazi lowriders and the Aryan Brotherhood, or an internal realignment within white supremacist ranks? Officials were cautious, aware that premature conclusions could inflame tensions further.